Hello, my dear ones. I hope you are well. Irini Hara streaming from Oslo for the podcast Autism on 360 degrees. And I'm going to continue with a series of videos and not interviews until I get more guests for the conversations. And this video today, it's about another topic that is still new for many, but not so new in the research arena. And it is something that I started to hear about several years ago. And it made all sense to me and to my own way of understanding also inter and transgenerational trauma and how ancestral trauma propagates up to us and how much it can condition us. And you might ask, what is the relationship between this branch of genetics called epigenetics and autism or neurodivergence or manifestations or neurodivergence? And I found a quite scientific explanation in a book I started to read recently. It's by Robert Melillo, who is a researcher into the brain, and is called The Scientific Truth About Preventing, Diagnosing, and Treating Autism Spectrum Disorders and What Parents Can Do Now, Autism. And he already wrote other books. One that I'm also purchasing and I intend to read is Disconnected Kids, because he explains, based on neuroscience and neuro research, the real causes of autism and how parents and specialists can intervene not only to, let's say, improve these symptoms or signs that autism often presents and that can make life a little bit difficult or challenging, but also for preventing the occurrence of autism in children. And he speaks about the essential role of epigenetics. But before I speak a little bit about this, I wish to speak about a little bit of history, and he actually writes about this in this book, and about statistics, because we can see nowadays an increase in cases of kids that are diagnosed on the spectrum of autism. And this author, Robert Melillo, says that autism was first identified in 1943 by Leo Kanner, a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University, after he encountered a 5-year-old boy whom he described as being withdrawn and living within himself. In his now classic research paper, published the same year in the journal The Nervous Child, Dr. Kanner wrote, "He seems to be self-satisfied. He has no apparent affection when petted. He does not observe the fact that anyone comes or goes and never seems glad to see father or mother or any playmate." And this child, who Dr. Kanner identified as Donald D., was but one of 11 problem children he was seeing at Johns Hopkins with similar troubling personality and social characteristics. These children, he noted, have come into the world with an innate inability to form the usual biologically provided affective contact with people. Hence, he called the condition autism, for the Greek word auto, meaning self. And he also noted these characteristics form a unique syndrome not heretofore reported, which seem rare enough, yet probably are more frequent than is indicated by the paucity of observed cases. How right he was. Unbeknownst to Dr. Kanner, around the same time across the Atlantic, similar observations were being documented by a German-born psychiatrist by the name Hans Asperger. In 1944, 1 year after Dr. Kanner's paper was published, Dr. Asperger wrote about a pattern of behavior in a group of young boys in Vienna that included lack of empathy, clumsiness, intense absorptions in a special interest, and the inability to form friendships. He describes these boys as little professors because of their fixation on a particular interest and their amazing ability to talk about it in detail uncommon to the average person, let alone a young child. He called the condition autistic psychopathy. Asperger's and Kant's path would never cross. So it's very interesting that these two psychiatrists, they made similar observation on similar patterns of behavior. And then they define it as being a spectrum, because each person that gets such a diagnosis has a different way of manifesting on the spectrum. At the time of Dr. Kanner's discovery and for a decade or after, autism was considered a rare condition that was seldom seen or talked about. The incidence of autism at that time was believed to be 1 or 2 children in 10,000, but by the 1960s, the number had doubled to 4 in 10,000. In the 1990s, the incidence was even higher, at 30 to 60 kids in 10,000. In 2005, research conducted at King's College in London concluded that prevalence of autism was actually much higher than previously thought. Today records, and we speak about when the book was published around 2012, gathered by CDC show that an estimated 1 out of 88 children in the United States, including 1 in 54 boys, are diagnosed with autism. And this represents an increase of 600 to 1,000% over the last 2 decades, depending on who's doing the math. Even at its most conservative estimate, this is an alarming increase, one that puts autism in the category of an epidemic. Polio, for example, was declared an epidemic when it affected 1 in 2,700 children. And of course, he writes a little bit more about these numbers, because we also have to consider that in general, the statistics are made on kids that are registered and display certain behaviors that are commonly identified as on the autistic spectrum. But many kids that are not at school and are still in the pre-schooling age might not be included in the statistics. And we also have to consider that before this date, or even before the times we live now, it was not so common to actually label these behaviors as being, let's say, out of the norm or into a syndrome. So many of the adults of today, when they were children, they have not diagnosed, because probably the healthcare system didn't have yet this labeling as common as it is today. Now, getting back to epigenetics, I'm going to read again because he writes better than I might explain myself, but then I would like to make some observations myself. Epigenetics has revolutionized the way scientists look at human biology and chronic disease. Even though identical twins are born with the same DNA, they can become surprisingly different as they grow older. Many things about them are absolutely the same: the hair, the eyes, facial features, skin type. This is their shared DNA, a genetic signature written in pen, what scientists call a genotype. As they grow, they develop their own personalities, their personal likes and dislikes, individual interests. They can even develop different diseases, and this is their phenotype. their individuality the sum of who they are. It's what scientists call an epigenetic effect. Epigenetics transforms cells from their original undifferentiated state during embryonic development into specific types of cells, orchestrating how our genotype develops into our phenotype. Epigenetics illustrates that the way genes are expressed early in life travels different paths over time, depending on life experiences and environmental exposure. Think of your DNA as a pianoforte, you can play music, and the genes are the keyboard. Each key represents a gene responsible for a particular trait. In essence, epigenetics determines how and when each key will be played, the melody that portrays our life. It trumps the effect of nurture and nature. The science of genetics has come a long way in the last hundreds of years. At one time, we thought our genes were our destiny with the same certainty that we know that brown-eyed parents will have brown-eyed children. We believed genes couldn't be changed, altered, or modified. And this idea has led many people to believe that if heart disease runs in their family, then heart disease will strike them too. However, genetics is no longer thought of as defining our destiny as we once believed, unless we have a rare genetic marker for one of the few diseases known to be caused by a defective gene and the way we live. There is probably no one better qualified to speak about genetics and disease than Francis Collins, director of the National Institute of Health and architect of the Human Genome Project, which set out to identify the approximately 30,000 genes in human DNA. In 2007, he told a US Senate committee that the rise in autism is not genetic, rather, he said, it is due to changes in the environment. Genes alone do not tell the whole story, he wrote. Recent increases in chronic diseases like diabetes, childhood asthma, obesity, or autism cannot be due to major shifts in the human gene pool, as those changes that take much more time to occur. They must be due to changes in the environment, including diet and physical activity, which may produce disease in genetically predisposed persons. And this observation makes more sense because we can notice in the last 20, 30 years a lot of negative changes upon our environment, starting with nutrition, with what we feed our body, that most of the cases, the food nowadays, because of all this processing made by food industry, and also because the agriculture is not so organic, although there are efforts to make it more organic, our food practically is poisoned with a lot of additives, with heavy metals and all sorts of chemicals that if they accumulate in the body at a certain point will not be able to release them or to detoxify, and then the accumulation can increase inflammation and can bring disease. Then think about the pollution level we have nowadays in many areas, especially in areas with industry or high density population in big cities around the globe, in big capitals. The pollution is invisible, but we breathe it and we inhale it inside our body every day. Think about the exposure to other risk factors and to practices, even in obstetrics and gynecology, that can bring a lot of trauma and traumatic events for the babies to be born while they are still in the fetus in the womb of the mother. All those effects from the environment, they can have a high incidence on the occurrence of syndromes like autism, and it starts in the womb. This is actually what this author says. And the weird thing is that many people don't even want to look into this path and how this accumulation of factors from the environment happen, because they got used with the idea that um, we cannot be harmed so much by the environment because we can actually protect ourselves. But there are so many factors that act in a way that is invisible, and it's quite difficult to control unless we become aware that we can decide on what kind of food we eat and how. We can decide where to live and how much we want to be exposed to pollution and other factors. And actually, we can decide, especially women, when we want to become parents, what kind of procedures and actually healthcare measures we can take to protect ourselves and our baby. And many people are not aware of this. I'm going to get back to what Robert Melillo says about epigenetics. And he says is not responsible for all cases of autism we are seeing today, because some genetic mutations arise spontaneously in children with no evidence of them in either parent. Evidence points to one source of these spontaneous mutations, the environment. Studies suggest that these genes, called de novo, new mutations, are the source of autism that arises in families with no history of autistic tendencies. Scientists call this sporadic autism, and it represents about 10% of cases, and they seem to be most common in older fathers. In one study, scientists identified 21 de novo gene changes in children with sporadic autism that were not found in their parents. This is not a genetic scenario that can be corrected by genetics, engineering, or treatment. The best way to stop de novo mutations is to identify the environmental factors causing them. And we have also to consider that our brain is very moldable, is the most adaptable organ in the human body. We owe this to neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to physically and chemically change based on experience and what is happening inside and outside of our bodies. In essence, neuroplasticity rewires the brain, also an epigenetic process, and it can happen very quickly. This means that if tomorrow's parents find out that they have environmental factors raising their odds of having a child with autism, they can start to take measures right now to reduce that risk. Out of the estimated 30,000 genes in the human genome, 85% of them relate to the brain and are instrumental in brain development. No one gene is causing the rise in autism we are seeing today. Each gene involved in brain development on its own has a relatively small impact on increasing the risk of autism. Autism develops from a confluence of genes involved in building social and cognitive skills that are either too weak to perform properly or are turned off so they can't perform at all. Researchers from Harvard University demonstrated how genes that are turned off could be turned on again after isolating a group of genes involving in learning in children with autism. They found the genes were silent, as if the on and off switch was broken. When they compared these genes to neuroplasticity genes that change the brain, they found a strong overlap, much more than what would be expected by chance. It means that neuroplasticity can literally jumpstart turned off genes, and turned on genes can promote neuroplasticity. This research also explains why some autistic children improve after repetitive type treatment intervention. And Christopher Walsh, one of the researchers, says that we know that intensive training or enriching of the environment in animal models has a way of turning genes on that would normally be silent. People think of genetic diseases as immutable and untreatable. Studies like ours and others give more hope we might not need to replace genes one by one, but find other ways of activating the genes that might be silent. So practically, what the specialists say, and I found this information and I actually resonate a lot with this information from the book of Melillo, is that there is hope and there are really great chances for autism recovery, or if you want, autistic traits and symptoms recovery. So contrary to what the mainstream used to say, that if you get a diagnosis for life and there is no chance of improvement, nowadays, for the last 20, 30 years, there are more and more voices among specialists in neuroscience, neuroplasticity, in studies of the nervous system, in diet and nutrition studies, saying that we can change the manifestation of autism and our other neurological conditions by changing the approach to it, by considering the environment, and that interferes also with the genetics through this epigenetics, considering it as a big part of why this manifestation happened, or why so high occurrence of children and people diagnosed with autism. And in this book, I also found an interesting information that might be useful for parents. The author, Robert Melillo, speaks about this occurrence of autism of being quite high in areas where there are a lot of scientists, engineers, and highly educated people as parents. And he gives the example of Silicon Valley, which is a highly technological kind of industrial park in America. And all these people are highly intelligent, highly qualified. They studied up to the level of PhD. And it's quite interesting that this somehow, this level of intelligence also relates with the occurrence of autism in their children. And he actually says that is a higher probability that can happen. And of course, there is also the age, because after 35, 30 years of age, mothers should also consider that can be possible, as it was for me. I didn't plan to have a boy diagnosed with autism, but I was 30 years old. I hold a PhD, so I did all sorts of academic studies up to this higher level. And I'm highly qualified professional. And still, I was hoping my son will be special, but I didn't know what kind of special until he got diagnosed. And since then, I'm searching for information and solutions, because I also have a close relationship with him as a single parent, and being for the moment, the highest authority in his life, I'm concerned with his future. And I say this so the parents who are in similar situations as me and have kids diagnosed on the spectrum, they can understand that everything is possible, but they need to open their eyes, get out of their own survival strategies. Do not listen to the mainstream that says there is nothing to do, because there is a lot to do. And everything that we can do is starting to know ourselves and to bring ourselves into balance, understanding also our environment and how this can influence the development of our child. And before I'm ending this video, I want also to bring a reflection on something, on a short video I saw. It was an interview taken to Gabor Mate, who is one of the most acclaimed specialists in trauma work and addiction in these last years, especially starting with pandemics. And somebody was interviewing him about ADHD. because I had a lot of connection lately with people who are diagnosed with ADHD. And actually, probably you also know that many children or person on the spectrum of autism, they sometimes can have, in addition to autism, also other diagnoses as ADHD or whatever label we want to put on specific manifestation that are neuroatypical. And he says, and this is something I already said since I started to work with trauma therapy and do therapy, and I had clients that displayed ADHD or having a diagnosis. But nobody wanted to actually listen to what I was saying because I'm not so authoritative as Gabor Mate or not so famous as him. But he says the same thing I was saying to people. ADHD is a survival strategy coming from early trauma, childhood trauma. It is not a phenotype. As we already spoke about epigenetics, now you know what is a phenotype. Because many people, even those on the spectrum of autism, they claim that their neuroatypical manifestation as autism or ADHD or whatever you want to call, it is a phenotype. We are like that. We are not going to change. And I'm going to say, and now Gabor Mate says, is to know it is a survival, a coping mechanism coming from trauma. Look into your trauma biography and you will start to understand it. Work with your trauma biography, you will start to recover. And this is the main advice I have for you today. Being a parent or a child or a person with autism or ADHD or other type of label, there is hope for you. It is not for life. And I'm going to end here and subscribe to the channel so you will keep notified. You'll be notified about future contents. And thank you for following me. Have a blessed day. Bye.